for having me. This is awesome. I really wish I could have been there in person, but in Salem, our busy season has already started, and I'm just here all the time giving tours. But um, I own the Salem Witch Board Museum. This was the world's only Ouija board museum, really covering the history from everything. Because there's so much history in Baltimore, I was finally able to open that second location above Bazaar. And these are the only two Ouija museums where you can learn everything about the Ouija board. In Salem, it makes sense because Parker Brothers, a gaming company here, had it, and so to have that history here. But Baltimore is really where it all started for the Ouija brand, and I think it's really important to have that history in that town to be able to show people not just to learn it there, but to be able to go out and see some of these things in person. I personally became obsessed with the Ouija board when I inherited my grandmother's Ouija. And hers was a William Fold Baltimore board. And but it looked like the look that most people think of, the couples in the corner using it. And when I went online, I saw hundreds, if not thousands, of boards. It really just set me off into starting to collect as many as I could, and eventually meeting other collectors and forming a group called the Talking Board Historical Society. My shirt is from that group. And we are a nonprofit. We research, preserve, and celebrate the history of these boards, and then open the museums up. So I'm obsessed with these. I left my job of 22 years to have these museums and be able to talk about the Ouija board every day. Sure. So we can start with tbhs.org. And like I said, we're a registered nonprofit. And before we formed the group, our president, Robert Murch, he had been researching Ouija boards, and he found Elijah Bond, who is the person who patented the Ouija board, found out that he was buried in an unmarked grave at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore. And all of us collectors were kind of sad that here's a guy that created something that has kind of brought us all together in our friendships, collecting these things, and he wasn't acknowledged. And so back then, in 2006, we raised money to put the headstone in for him. And if you get a chance to go to Greenmount, it's the Ouija headstone. It looks just like what the patent looked like. And that was kind of the first thing we did unofficially as the Talking Board Historical Society. Then from there, we uncovered Helen Peters, who was the woman who named the board, asked it what it wanted to be called, and it's spelled back Ouija. She helped prove it worked at the patent office. She was actually Elijah's sister-in-law. And she also was sadly buried in a grave with her name wasn't put on the headstone. That's out in Denver, but we raised money a few years ago for that. And then we've done quite a few things in Baltimore where the Ouija was named. There's currently a 7-Eleven on North Charles Street, and we were able to put a plaque up in the 7-Eleven by getting permission from the corporate office to put that in. So the first public landmark in the state is actually the factory, the building where the factory William Fold had built to manufacture the Ouija board. He used the board and told him he should build that factory. He ended up falling from the roof and dying from his injuries. And on his deathbed, he told his family not to sell Ouija, which, strange enough, on the 39th anniversary of his death, they sold to Parker Brothers in Salem. But that's on the corner of Hartford, Lamont, and Federal Streets. That building there is still there. Yeah, it's a hard date to pinpoint exactly because they're evolving and there's no inventor. It's the two separate spirit communication tools that are crossing paths during the Civil War. People believing they could communicate with spirits, that they heard knocking responses back to them, would try asking yes and no questions or try counting knocks to figure out what letter of the alphabet it might correspond with, to eventually just pointing to the alphabet on a board and waiting for a knock. Eventually, that piece crosses with an automatic writing planchette, which is similar to what we see with the Ouija today, but it had a pencil at the front and wheels in the back, and worked by a medium just channeling a spirit through themselves and then writing or drawing on a piece of paper. So those cross paths, and they're all homemade really until 1890 when Kennard produced it. We start hearing newspaper reports by the 1870s, but by 1886, a couple things happen. We see the very first depiction of what one of these boards now looks like. That's from Akron, Ohio. The headline to the paper called it a devil board. And the same year, Grover Cleveland, who was the only president to be married in the White House, he was gifted a witch board from a local Massachusetts company, and that made the newspapers quite a bit. So those two things in particular come out. There had been a few articles before that, but 1886 is where I kind of my date where these two things have officially married each other and are being used together. So much history is in Baltimore. And when we talk about Helen Peters, and I tell you, she named the board, she proved to work for the patent office, she was out of history for 100 years. You know, we didn't go looking for her information. We had no reason to. But as we research, you know, a lot of places are not digitized. We still turn book pages one at a time. We still look through microfiche. And Murch discovered a series of letters that were written to the Baltimore Sun newspaper back in 1919. Someone wrote in and asked, hey, where'd the Ouija come from? And luckily, 29 years later, a lot of the original manufacturers, people involved with the company, lived in Baltimore. Each one of those people wrote back with their version of the story. And we had to sift through stories of people not remembering anything correctly, trying to make themselves look more important than they were. But eventually a story develops. People claim to be present at a seance where a woman asked the board what it wanted to be called. Not one of those people mentioned her by name. We had to go through, you know, where the seance happened was the rooming house back then, and had to go through census records to everyone there, the ancestry to every single one of those people, only to go, Helen Peters, oh, her sister married Elijah Bond, who patented the Ouija board. That was 6 years of research to uncover that story. And you know, now luckily it's the information is getting out there quicker. But anything in print more than 10 years ago will not be up to date with the Ouija board because it won't mention Helen. So, you know, making sure that I tell the story correctly is very important, because if I say something slightly wrong, before you know it, it snowballs, and it's, you know, like playing telephone. About a fifth person, they're now saying something that's wrong. That's where these superstitions started, were things like that. People had an experience and they told their friend, and the next thing you know, that's what they're expecting, or that's what they experienced, or in those things have led down that path. And for the history, though, I think it's really important to get it from a reputable source. I had someone arguing with me the other day that was like, yeah, Ouija, mean it's German and French for yes, yes. And I was trying to explain to him, yes, you believe that because the guy put it on the box for 70 years because he was trying to market it to make it seem like it's more worldly, more, you know, something bigger than Baltimore. But the real story is Helen naming it. But he was insisting that no, if you pronounce it, that's exactly what it is. And I'm like, here's the history, here's how it was discovered. But people will still not really want to understand or listen to that. They want to believe what they want to believe. But as a historian, I think it's really important for me to try to tell you the story as accurate as possible. So Helen was never a member of the company. She was never part of the company whatsoever. She was the sister-in-law to Elijah, and because they were selling a witch board already. That was their product, witch board. She held the seance. She was known as a strong medium. That's what we know about her. That's how she's described in those letters from the Baltimore Sun. So she had the seance and then asked it what it wanted to be called. She was a stockholder in the company with the stock in her name, which was pretty uncommon at that time. But eventually she cashed out of it. She did turn her back on the Ouija board and believed it had lied to her and that it was evil. So in her dying days, she told, you know, people don't trust Ouija. That's a whole nother story, but she did turn her back on it. So when Fold takes over, he's not going to promote a woman who doesn't want to touch the Ouija board. So he's now marketing it in a different way. Helen died poor because the stock market crash, you know. So they moved out to Denver because of this rift that they had because of the Ouija board that her and the family had. She moved out to Denver with a husband, and she turned her back on the Ouija. She never went back to Baltimore. Her sister never went to go visit her in Denver that we found proof of. But you know, Helen dies poor mostly because she had lost her money in the stock market. Well, I mean, because they come out just after Civil War, it's everyone affected by death. You know, so much death, everyone was affected. And so using these boards to really find comfort and closure. So of course, all the wars, they kind of peak in popularity. But surprising enough, the Great Depression in the 30s, you would think that money was tight, you wouldn't spend money on a Ouija board, but quite the opposite. There were actually 3 factories just in Baltimore alone producing the Ouija board. So really, any time of uncertainty, death, or any kind of questions, for that, because even during the war, you're reaching out to a deceased loved one, but we have boards in the museum where they have answers already pre-written on them. Relationship questions: who will I marry? When the war will end? And one of them in particular is pretty accurate. One of the options is Germany will surrender when Hitler dies by his own hand. So they're using it in these other ways other than spirit communication, where it's an oracle. And so really, any time of uncertainty is when they're most popular. They leave it pretty loose, and they don't tell you how it works at the very beginning, which is why it is patented as a toy, because they're leaving it up to you to decide how it's working. But the funny thing that most people never think about with the Ouija board is, by the 1920s, it's being marketed as a dating tool. The rules in 1920 say, that it's best played between a man and a woman. It's best played with the board on your lap, so your knees are touching, you're in a dim lit room, and you're unchaperoned. And when you look at some of the imagery from 1920, like the Norman Rockwell Saturday Evening Post drawing, it's on the cover of Popular Science. There's Valentine's Day cards and about a dozen songs at that time, all written about the Ouija board, which were all kind of love songs. So, it does get marketed in this way that most people would never think about. And once you take it into the 70s, it goes off the rails. You got the psychic sex board, which is the board you consult spirits if you'll have lights on tonight or not. And even by the late 60s, Parker Brothers, who now owns it, or owned it then, they have pictures of guys and girls using it in a very dark room. And it just says, Ouija's weird, Ouija's wonderful. And the last line of the ad says, you may even get a little turned on. So, the rules, surprisingly, early on, are all about kind of getting a guy and a girl together. My favorite board was actually made in Baltimore, and there's one at the Witch Board Museum, Baltimore, above Bazaar. It's a metal board, and it's called the Electric Mystifying Oracle. It's pretty large, and the planchette that came with it was metal. It had ball bearing casters, a battery on the bottom, a battery, and a light bulb inside. And it would pass over these bumps that you see on this metal board, and the light would light up. And 1933, a regular typical Ouija board, a wooden one, would have sold for about $1.50. The metal one had sold for almost $5. And so the company put all their capital into it. It was, unfortunately, it was a flop. People, didn't want to spend that kind of money during the war. They would buy the wooden one for $1.50. So really, World War II came, they scrapped them all, and we only know of 9 boards, 5 planchettes. So you're able to see one of those boards in Baltimore. Which board is my absolute favorite? Of course, I can't say I named the museum after it, but certainly it was in consideration because it's one of my favorites. The first Witch Board, 1986, is really the first movie that made the Ouija board the star of the film. Everything happens around the Ouija board in that. And so that's my most near and dear. But there's over 500 horror movies that put the Ouija board in it. I do horror movie nights here at the museum in Salem. And a couple weeks ago, we actually played Ouija Shark 2, a prehistoric alligator called the Tarrogator versus a shark. So they get pretty schlocky, but horror movies and Ouija boards, they go hand in hand from the beginning. The first talking horror movie, The Terror, had a Ouija board in it. So Witch board's my favorite. Of course, The Exorcist, who doesn't love that? And The Exorcist is really the movie that changed a lot of people's views towards the Ouija board. It really wasn't seen as a negative thing by most people until after that movie. And it had been in films, but when The Exorcist came out, it really started taking it to a much darker place. And so by the time you get to Witch Board, by the Satanic Panic, Kevin Tenney, the writer and director, he sets it up with something called progressive entrapment. So the more you use the Ouija board, the weaker you become, the slowly it takes possession of you. And so when we start talking about possessions through the Ouija board, it really has a lot to do with these films. The Exorcist, the first one, and then by Witch Board. So those are my top two favorite movies with Ouija boards. But recently there was Veronica that came out, a Spanish horror movie, and I highly suggest seeing that. That's on Netflix, and that's actually a pretty scary one. Well, I mean, I'm a fan of Ouija board, Witch board being in any movie. I'll take it in any movie. Like I said, even Ouija Shark 2, which was a pretty horrible movie by my standards, but the people here had a standing ovation for it. So personally, I'll put it in any. I'll take it in any movie. Um, the Exorcist, I do like the more serious ones, the scarier films with it. And The Exorcist, like I said, not only just changed people's views towards the Ouija board, it's really how the superstition "don't use the Ouija board alone" starts from. Uh, that you always say goodbye on the Ouija board. Those were not rules prior to The Exorcist. Today, they're kind of common things that most people think about the Ouija when they use it, but they started from horror movies. And since you mentioned Mike Flanagan working on Ouija, he worked on the second one, Origin of Evil. In that movie, there's a scene where the little girl takes the planchette, kind of looks through the eye, and sees who she's talking with. Well, I have people come to Salem now and start insisting that it is something that has happened from the very beginning of these boards. And I'll point out, no, it happened in the movie. That's where it starts. But they'll insist it started earlier. So that is an urban legend that very well could get traction in the next 10 to 20 years, that we start hearing people say more and more of. That's part of the ritual of the use of Ouija board. So when a lot of people start believing about Ouijas, come from movies, whether you've seen them or not. What's brilliant about The Exorcist is they don't talk about the Ouija board in there. That's the how they claim how Reagan, when the Blair became possessed, was she had used it alone. But they never actually talk about it. They never blame the Ouija board. So because when that movie came out, before video rental stores, before cable television, so many people saw the movie in the theater back then, would then go to a party, a couple of years later, where the Ouija board was pulled out, and they're like, yeah, I'm not going to touch it. But they don't even know why they're thinking that they don't want to touch it, why they're afraid of it, because it had planted subliminally in their brains. That movie was based on a true story of a boy in St. Louis. And, when you go see a horror movie that's based on a true story, you go in thinking that what I see on the screen is something that might happen to me. Funny enough, most people, a little known fact about The Exorcist, the Ouija board actually wasn't even part of the original story. Here in Salem, we have the original script for The Exorcist, and it came directly from the writer, William Peter Blatty, who gifted it to my friend Murch. And Murch asked him directly, if the Ouija board's not part of the story that inspired your story, how or why would you even want to put it in there? And his answer, I was looking for what caused the possession. I thought the Ouija board was a good way to explain how the kid was able to get into mischief without the parents knowing. Talking to Captain Howdy, the mother had no idea. In 1967, after Parker Brothers bought the Ouija brand, the first full year of production, it outsold Monopoly. 2 million boards were sold. So that means almost every house in America had a Ouija board in it. And what's scarier than something in your house? Yeah, I mean, Kevin did a really great job writing it. He had taken some of these stories that he had heard, true crime stories and urban legends and things, and kind of put it into his film. So, like I said, progressive entrapment is something that he introduces that really, the more you use the Ouija board, the slowly it takes possession of you. And that only reinforces what people had already kind of been thinking after The Exorcist. But because his movie came out during the Satanic Panic, I mean, it gets a lot of attention for that. And like I said, it makes the Ouija board the star of the film. So to me, it's the greatest of all of them because of the impact that it has on people, whether they know it or not. A lot of these horror movies, people don't realize where these things start. And it doesn't really even matter where it starts. If you believe you shouldn't use the Ouija board alone, don't, because if you believe you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, it might influence what happens. So they influence the people in a greater way than maybe as many people who maybe didn't see the movie, but just through word of mouth and saying things that people just believe over time. You say something long enough and it kind of becomes the truth with stuff. So with Witchboard, Kevin did a fantastic job. Now, I should tell you that when he wrote the script, he was in film school, and the studio picked it up. He called the script Ouija originally, and the studio picked it up, said you can direct it, and he dropped out of school, 3 credits shy, and he never went back. The studio said, you think you can call it Ouija, but we're pretty sure Parker Brothers will sue you. You can't use that name; it's a trademark. And so when he shot the film, he shot all of the scenes of them using the Ouija board from a distance, and they used a real Ouija board. At the last minute, he was like, screw that, I'm not paying a bunch of lawyers. So he had the prop department come up with a board. This is actually glued to a piece of paper, but this is here. And they designed this board here. Well, a little Easter egg you can look for in the film is that it took me a very long time to notice this, but as Tawny Kitane's character is slowly becoming more possessed by the board will physically change what it looks like. So on this board, you'll see some angel wings on the cherub and the angels in the corner. But over time, it switches to bat wings and then to devil wings. And this is a prop from the second Witchboard film, which I hope you play at some point because I like it just as much as Witchboard. Amy Dolenz, Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees' daughter, is the star. And this is a real prop from the second movie, 1993. None of that CGI crap. They used real practical effects. And so they made 22 castings of this hand in various positions so they could take a picture of each one to do stop motion for it. So the first 2 Witchboard films are 2 of my favorite. And look for that little Easter egg where you see the little wings on these things changing from angel to bat to devil. Of course, I grew up during this time frame. So Tawny, to me, was very famous famous in my childhood. She was in the Whitesnake video. She rolls around the hood of the car. But the other one in there, the little not Easter egg, the small little character is Rosemarie, who was pretty famous for the Bounty commercials in the 80s. And so she is the neighbor and she makes an appearance. And to me, I love that because just to see this kind of not random person, but fairly random famous person in this movie was pretty awesome as well.
It does feel like a blueprint, in some ways for seance films to come, for any film involving a witch board to come, where you have a certain group of people, someone who's very witchy sitting there, like a medium of some kind, and you have a non-believer, you have someone who's very, afraid of the witch board. And so watching this film, I realized, this really does feel like a blueprint in a lot of ways for a lot of films to come. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the only other character you're missing is the person who is disrespectful. You get the skeptics, but then you get the person who's kind of like saying things like, this is stupid, you're a dumb spirit. And that's enough to then make that spirit angry enough to cause chaos afterwards. So yeah, I think there is a blueprint for a lot of the Ouija films similar to that, where it's setting up. But I think most people can relate to it because the Ouija board is sold in stores. So it's very accessible to kids. So a lot of times that is somebody's first experience with the paranormal, and again, you don't take it seriously, you go looking for trouble on the Ouija board, you'll probably find it. And I think most people have that experience. That's a great question. I don't know how I would answer it exactly. If I was at the seance, I'd probably be the one quiet, waiting to see what happens, hoping that something is going to happen. Who doesn't want something? I mean, the point you use a Ouija board for is you're waiting for something to happen. I think what's interesting is most people kind of get the confirmation they're looking for, and it's one and done. They use it one time, and like, it worked for you, it did exactly what you wanted. You wanted confirmation it was an afterlife, and here it is, but you don't want it. So I think I'd probably just be the guy waiting for something to happen and playing it cool either way. No, I don't know there is a formula to it. I would probably suggest maybe not doing the formula and take it somewhere else. As much as I didn't like Ouija Shark 1 or 2, they're making a third one. I entertain the idea that they did something a little bit different. I have Ouija Mummy in the case. I still haven't watched that one yet. I don't know if that sounds what exactly I know what's going to happen, but my suggestion would be maybe think a little bit out of the box and try to not come up with your typical seance scene where they use it, disrespect it, something happens in some other way. Like even like Stranger Things, I liked how they added the lights to it. They started with knocking, which is how all of this kind of evolves from. And most people didn't think of it as a Ouija board because she used string lights and she wrote the alphabet on the wall. So kind of doing something a little bit outside the box, I would like to see something like that happen. Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I always tell people, I believe you believe. I've never heard one Ouija story where I think that person is making it up. I mean, you'll hear stories where people talk about lights flickering and things moving around the room on their own, and but not one of those stories I've ever heard do I feel as though they're lying to me. They're telling me pretty matter of fact. No, I used the Ouija board, and this happened, that happened. So I'm open to all of those things. I want to hear about it. Like I said, spirit communication is the predominant way, most popular way people use these. But if someone tells me that they were communicating with their plant or animal, yeah, tell me, what did it say? I want to know. So I leave it open, just like any religion kind of being formed on faith towards something that doesn't seem possible. I apply that to the Ouija board, and tell me your story. I want to hear it. I'm interested. There are actually a lot of true crime stories. The first suicide is 1900, associated with the Ouija board, and there's plenty of murders. Um, One of the more interesting ones to me is in 1935, Kansas City, Missouri, a woman named Nellie Hurd had been using the Ouija board, and it told her that her 77-year-old husband was cheating on her and that he'd hidden money. She believed the Ouija board, and she tied the husband up to the bed. She would torture him by taking the butt of the gun, hitting over the head, taking the hot poker from the fireplace, burning the bottom of his feet. She tortured him for years. I've often wondered if Stephen King might have heard that story before he wrote Misery, but anyways, this is a true story, 1935. He was finally able to break free, shoot and kill her with a gun, and no charges were brought against him. Funny enough, another story I can tell you is back in 1920 in El Cerrito, California, they tried to ban the Ouija board. They were unsuccessful. 7 people were driven insane after using the Ouija board, and they were committed to a mental institution after using it. Um, Now, scientists, they've studied the Ouija board on other things, as far as how it's working, which they call ideomotor response, your subconscious and muscle memory. But as far as using the Ouija board and you know, anything else other than that, I'm not really sure. I always tell people, I'm like, any of the stories I tell you, I don't know if I'm blaming the Ouija board for anything. You know what I mean? It, I can connect the Ouija board to just about anything, from religion to politics. It has impacted in some way. The obvious is the horror movies, but there's plays, there's music not just written about the Ouija board as early as 1901. There's people claiming to have written lyrics through the Ouija board on there. Mars Volta, 15 years ago, claimed they wrote all the lyrics on their records that way. It's touched literature, not just about the Ouija board. People have claimed that Mark Twain dictated a book back to them through the Ouija board. It was published as Mark Twain. Frank Baum, the author of The Wizard of Oz, supposedly dictated a book to a 9 and 16-year-old kid through the Ouija board. That was published as The Invisible Inzi of Oz. Pulitzer Prize-winning books of poetry have been written through the Ouija board by James Merrill. So it really can almost touch on anything, which is why I think it's popular. I mean, I don't get to see the numbers of what Hasbro sells today. They don't share that with me. But in Salem, I sell vintage boards and some new ones as well. And my sales are up. And I thought, after COVID, people, were sick of being locked down and Netflix and things like that. But this many years later, my sales are up here. And I think a lot of the sales have to do with everyone knows somebody who's died because of COVID. So people here in Salem are buying the boards to use. They're not just, I come from being a collector first to wanting to know more about them, but the people I meet here in Salem are buying them to use them. So I think they're still very popular. Recently, you have the Wednesday board come out for the next Netflix show. There'll be an Exorcist board coming out soon. They already pre-ordered it now, tied to the original Exorcist. There was the Chucky board, the Child's Play 2 board, and luckily, Merch and I just consulted with Winning Moves, and they made a Salem edition of the Ouija. So it came out. So just in the last couple of months, that's 4 or 5 different mainstream, like more popular things that have happened. So it connects to just about everything, and it is still very popular today. The Ouija board, you think it's the alphabet on a board, and that Parker Brothers or William Fold made it, and it can't have much history behind it. But I mean, people come to this museum multiple times, and they hear different stories every time. I think that I'm now part of the museum in a lot of ways, because they come check on me to make sure I'm still as enthusiastic as I was when they first met me, which I think I am, but also that there's just so much depth to the history, and it can go in a lot of different directions. I cater all of my tours and guidance based on what you're interested in. You might want to talk about spiritualism, and we can talk about that for a good 20 minutes or so. If you want to talk about lawsuits and litigation about the Ouija board, talk about that. You want to go right to the movies, cool. So there's a lot of directions it can go to, and for me, I love that, because I get to see what people are most interested in hearing about. It's not the same for everyone. Believe me, I'm leaving out some good parts to the story in Baltimore. If you go read some of the signs that we have there, how Elijah Bond's grave was found out, discovering it, telling you that John Waters is part of the story in some way. That's in the sign there. So I'll leave little, I want you to go do a little bit on your own, go explore. I don't want to tell everything here. I want you to go find out there. And if you have questions, please, reach out to me. I'm happy to answer those questions. But yeah, there's a lot of weird history to Baltimore, and start with that museum in Baltimore. I think you'll be surprised. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. You're watching one of my favorite movies, and please enjoy. And hopefully the next time you play Witchboard 2, it'll be not in a crazy time in Salem, and I'll be able to come down in person and be there. All right, have fun. Take care.